June 22, 1941. The German Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. To the world, the German panzer divisions looked invincible. They had crushed Poland in weeks and bypassed the impenetrable Maginot Line to conquer France in just over a month. As thousands of German tanks rolled across the Soviet border, the Nazi High Command expected another lightning war. They believed the Red Army was unorganized, poorly equipped, and technologically backwards. For the first few weeks, it seemed they were right. But then, near a small river crossing in Belarus, the German 17th Panzer Division encountered a ghost. Out of the tree line emerged a tank unlike anything the Germans had ever seen. It was low to the ground, with a strangely wide stance and armor that slanted backward at an aggressive angle. The German crews didn't panic at first. They did what they had been trained to do. They aimed their 37mm door-knocker anti-tank guns and fired. The shell hit the front of the Soviet tank dead on, but instead of an explosion, there was only a shower of sparks. The shell didn't penetrate, it ricocheted upward into the sky. The German gunners fired again and again. One German report from the front lines described the horror of hitting a Soviet tank 22 times with anti-tank shells, only to watch the machine continue driving as if it were being pelted with pebbles. This was the T-34, and for the German Panzerwaffe, it was the start of a tactical nightmare. The German panzers of 1941, like the Panzer III, were built like boxes, vertical walls of steel that were easy to hit and easy to pierce. The T-34 was a revolutionary leap forward. By angling its armor, the Soviet engineers had cheated physics. A shell hitting that slope had to travel nearly twice as much metal to get inside. But it wasn't just the armor. As the German tanks tried to maneuver to the T-34's side, they found themselves sinking. The Russian summer rains had turned the plains into a sea of thick, black mud. The narrow tracks of the German panzers acted like knives, cutting deep into the earth and trapping the tanks where they stood. Meanwhile, the T-34, with its massive, wide tracks, seemed to walk on top of the mud, circling the German trapped like a predator. By the time the sun set on that first encounter, the German crews realized they weren't just fighting a country, they were fighting a machine that made their entire arsenal obsolete. The panic of 1941 wasn't just about losing a battle, it was the terrifying realization that the subhuman East had out-engineered the master race. The Soviet hammer had arrived, and the war would never be the same.
To the average person in 1940, a tank was simply a box of moving metal, but to Mikhail Koshkin, the lead designer of the T-34, a tank was a series of mathematical problems that needed to be solved before the first shot was ever fired. Koshkin knew that the Soviet Union couldn't out-polish the Germans, so he decided to outthink them. The most revolutionary feature of the T-34, the one that would change tank design forever, was sloped armor. If you look at a German Panzer III or a British Matilda from that era, they look like armored skyscrapers. Their walls are vertical. If a shell hits a 45mm vertical plate, it only has to travel through 45mm of steel to kill the crew inside. Koshkin realized this was a waste of weight. He tilted the T-34's front armor back at a 60-degree angle. Suddenly, that same 45mm plate became a 90mm nightmare for the enemy. Because the shell is entering at an angle, it has to travel through a much longer horizontal path of steel. It's a genius physics cheat code. It gave the T-34 the protection of a heavy tank with the weight and speed of a light tank. But sloped armor did something else even more demoralizing. It encouraged ricochets. Instead of the shell's energy focusing on a single point to punch through, the angle diverted that energy upward. German gunners watched in horror as their expensive, high-velocity shells simply skidded off the T-34's hull like stones skipping across a pond. But protection is useless if the tank is stuck in the mud, and Russia is the world capital of mud. This led to the second engineering miracle, the wide track philosophy. German tanks were designed for paved roads of Western Europe. They had narrow tracks that exerted massive pressure on the ground, nearly 15 pounds per square inch. When the Russian autumn rains turned the earth into Rasputitsa, the sea of mud, the German tanks sank to their bellies. Koshkin gave the T-34 massive 20-inch wide tracks. This lowered the ground pressure to about the same as a human foot. While the German panzers were becoming stationary targets, the T-34 was literally floating over the swamp, able to flank and destroy the enemy at will. Powering this beast was the V2 diesel engine. Most tanks of World War II used gasoline engines, which were essentially giant Molotov cocktails waiting to explode. One spark and the crew was incinerated. Diesel, however, is much harder to ignite. You could fire a bullet into a tank of diesel and it likely wouldn't explode. This made the T-34 incredibly survivable. It also gave the tank massive torque and a range of nearly 250 miles, double what most German tanks could manage. However, the most incredible part of this engineering miracle wasn't the machine itself, but the sacrifice of the man who built it. To prove to Stalin that this tank was ready for the Great Patriotic War, Mikhail Koshkin personally drove 2 T-34 prototypes from his factory in Kharkiv all the way to Moscow in the dead of winter. It was a 1,200-mile journey through blizzards and sub-zero temperatures. The tanks survived, but Koshkin didn't. He contracted pneumonia during the drive and died shortly after the tank was approved for production. He never saw his creation in battle, but he had given the Soviet Union the ultimate shield. The T-34 wasn't just a collection of parts, it was the physical embodiment of Soviet survival. It was fast, it was tough, and most importantly, it was designed to be built by the millions.
If you were to walk through a German tank factory in 1942, it would look like a laboratory. Engineers in clean uniforms used precision tools to craft the Tiger and Panther tanks. Every bolt was tightened to the exact millimeter. Every piece of glass in the optics was crystal clear. The Germans were building masterpieces. But when you stepped into a Soviet tank factory in the Urals, the scene was a nightmare. It was dark, freezing, and filled with the deafening roar of sledgehammers hitting raw iron. The people building the tanks weren't master craftsmen. They were teenagers, women, and elderly men who had never seen a blueprint in their lives. And yet they were building the weapon that would win the war. This brings us to the great paradox of the T-34. It was a rough masterpiece. To a Western eye, the T-34 looked like junk. The welding seams along the turret weren't smooth. They were jagged, thick, and sometimes still glowing red when the tank rolled out of the factory. The paint was slapped on with brushes, often leaving bubbles and drips. Inside, it was even worse. There was no soundproofing, there were no padded seats. The floor was often littered with metal shavings left over from the assembly line. But there was a cold, hard logic behind this ugliness. The Soviet High Command ran the numbers. They realized that the average life expectancy of a tank in high-intensity combat was only 6 months, and in a major battle like Kursk, it was often less than 24 hours. The Soviets asked a revolutionary question. Why spend 500 man-hours polishing a tank that is going to be blown up in its first week of service? They stripped away every luxury. They stopped machining parts that didn't absolutely need to be precise. If a part didn't help the tank move or shoot, it was deleted. The early T-34s didn't even have radios. The tank commander had to communicate with other tanks by waving colored flags out of the hatch, a suicide mission in the middle of a gunfight. Inside the tank, communication was even more primitive. To tell the driver which way to turn, the commander would literally kick him in the shoulders. A kick to the left meant turn left, a kick to the right meant turn right. The gearboxes were so poorly made and heavy that the driver couldn't shift them by hand. Most T-34 drivers carried a heavy wooden mallet. When they needed to change gears, they would let go of the steering levers and bash the gear stick into place with the hammer. To the Germans, this was subhuman engineering. But this roughness gave the Soviets a secret power: total mass production. Because the T-34 didn't require specialized tools or master mechanics, the Soviets could build them anywhere. When the Germans invaded, the Soviets dismantled entire factories, put them on trains, and moved them to the Ural Mountains. There they built Tankograd, a city dedicated to one thing: steel. They simplified the T-34 design so much that they cut the production time in half. By 1943, the Soviet Union was producing over 1,000 T-34s every month. For every one perfect German Tiger tank that took months to build, the Soviets produced 10 ugly T-34s. On the battlefield, it didn't matter that the T-34's welds were messy or that the driver had to use a hammer to shift gears. What mattered was that there were always more T-34s. The T-34 was the ultimate disposable warrior. It was built to be destroyed, but it was also built to be replaced. This was the brutal reality of the Eastern Front. The war wasn't won by the most beautiful machine. It was won by the machine that could be built in the middle of a blizzard by a hungry teenager. By the autumn of 1941, the Soviet Union was facing total industrial collapse. The German blitzkrieg had swallowed the breadbasket of Ukraine and was surging toward the industrial heartlands of Moscow and Leningrad. If Stalin lost his factories, the T-34 would become a ghost, a brilliant design with no place to be born. What happened next is often called the second miracle of the war. It wasn't a battle fought with tanks, but with trains, shovels, and raw human will. Stalin issued a decree. Every factory, every lathe, and every skilled worker in the path of the German advance was to be uprooted and moved thousands of miles east, behind the safety of the Ural Mountains. In a matter of weeks, over 1,500 major factories were dismantled. This wasn't an organized relocation. It was a desperate race against death. Workers labored through the night to unscrew heavy machinery from concrete floors, while German artillery shells exploded in the distance. These massive steel machines were loaded onto open-air flatbed trains. Millions of workers and their families piled into cattle cars, embarking on a journey into the frozen unknown of Siberia. The destination was a city called Chelyabinsk, but the world would soon know it by a different name: Tankograd. When the workers arrived in the Urals, there was nothing waiting for them but frozen earth and sub-zero winds. There were no houses, no barracks, and in many cases no factory buildings. But the orders were clear: must not stop. This is one of the most harrowing chapters in military history. The Soviets set up their lathes and assembly lines in the open air, under the falling snow. They built the tanks first, and the walls of the factory second. Stories emerged of workers literally freezing to the metal they were welding. Because most of the men had been sent to the front to die in the trenches, the army of Tankograd was made up of 13-year-old boys, women, and grandfathers.
They worked 16-hour shifts. They slept on the dirt floors next to their machines. Food was a luxury. A thin slice of black bread and watery soup was often the only fuel for the people building the steel hammer of the Red Army. But the miracle worked. By early 1942, while the Germans were struggling to produce a few hundred tanks a month in their comfortable heated factories, the slaves of Tankograd were churning out thousands. They had simplified the T-34 even further. Every part that could be stamped instead of machined was changed. They reduced the number of parts in the T-34's hull by nearly 30% to speed up production. The Germans, watching from their reconnaissance planes, couldn't believe their eyes. Their intelligence told them the Soviet industry had been destroyed. Yet every day, endless trains were steaming out of the Urals, heading west, loaded with fresh, green-painted T-34s. Tankograd had become an industrial volcano, pouring a river of steel onto the German army. It was here, in the freezing mud and smoke of the Urals, that the German Wehrmacht truly lost the war. They had outfought the Red Army in 1941, but they could never outproduce the madness and the sacrifice of the Soviet workers. The T-34 was no longer just a tank. It was the vengeance of a nation that refused to die. By 1943, the tide of the war was turning. But the T-34 faced a new, terrifying crisis. The Germans had learned their lesson from the Panic of 1941. They had unleashed their own monsters, the Tiger and the Panther. These new German tanks had optics that could hit a target from 2 miles away, and armor so thick the T-34's 76mm guns simply couldn't dent it. For a moment, the Soviet hammer was blunted. But the beauty of the T-34's simple design was how easily it could be upgraded. The Soviets took the hull of the T-34 and fitted it with a massive enlarged turret and an 85mm high-velocity gun originally designed for anti-aircraft use. This was the T-34-85. It wasn't just a tank anymore. It was a tiger killer. In the summer of 1943, the two greatest tank armies in history met on the plains of Kursk. It was the largest tank battle the world had ever seen. The Germans brought their quality, the heavy, slow, but powerful Tigers. The Soviets brought their quantity, thousands of T-34s. The Soviet tactics were as brutal as their tanks. Because their guns were less accurate at long range, T-34 crews were ordered to charge directly at the Tigers at full speed, closing the distance until they were point blank. It was a mechanical bayonet charge. In the dust and smoke of Kursk, T-34s rammed into German tanks, locking them in a death embrace and firing directly into their weaker side armor. The master race's steel was crushed by the sheer weight of Soviet numbers. From Kursk, the steel tide began its unstoppable march west. The T-34/85 became the spearhead of Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that annihilated the German Army Group center. The T-34 was now the hunter. It chased the retreating Wehrmacht through the forests of Poland, across the frozen rivers of East Prussia, and finally into the streets of Berlin. In May 1945, as the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag, the T-34 was there, idling in the rubble-strewn streets. It had traveled from the drawing boards of a dying designer in Kharkov, through the freezing open-air factories of the Urals, all the way to the heart of the Nazi Empire. But the T-34 story didn't end with the fall of Hitler. It had changed the DNA of warfare. The T-34 was the world's first truly successful main battle tank. It proved that a single vehicle could be fast, well-armored, and powerfully armed. It became the most produced tank in history, with over 84,000 units built. Long after World War II, the T-34 served in North Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, and Africa. Even today, over 80 years after its birth, T-34s are still seen in parades and occasionally in small regional conflicts. The T-34 was never a perfect tank. It was loud, it was cramped, and it was rough. But in the 20th century's darkest hour, it was the perfect weapon. It was the machine that allowed the Soviet Union to survive, to fight back, and to win. It was, and forever will be, the Soviet hammer.